a little bit after 4 o'clock. Jason Belzer, founder for Athlete NIL, attorney representing coaches, joins us on 365 Sports with Craig and Paul, and I'm David Smoak. Jason, I just happened to see your tweet about it's transfer portal, it's wide open. It's one thing when you're being flirted with or you're being courted, oh man, I get that kind of money. Your thoughts about the players, how many, in your opinion, might enter the transfer portal, move on somewhere else, and yet not fulfill their own commitment?
We're going to have at least a couple of thousand kids in the transfer portal. It will likely be the most active transfer portal in the history of the NCAA. It will also be the largest amount of money that will be transacted. We believe that the number will be in the area of around $400 million that will be issued via these collectives over the next year. And I am a big believer that we will be in revenue share in 2025. So this might be the most money ever given out through NIL at least. And so the next couple of weeks are going to be certainly a very busy time for collectives and coaching staffs as they make their way through this process.
So you mentioned in your tweet about adult actions have adult consequences, and how much of that is prevalent where you guys are not, maybe understanding that you have deliverables that you had to do and you've decided to leave Texas A&M and go to USC. Well, you still owe the Aggie Collective whatever you promised them.
Yeah, so it's interesting. The reality is, and to preface it for listeners, our organization, Student Athlete NIL, runs more than 40 different collectives. So I can only speak to the schools that we work with, schools like Oklahoma and Rutgers and Wake Forest and Georgia Tech and Notre Dame. When we sign a student athlete, as a business, we have expectations that student athlete will uphold their end of the bargain. And that end of the bargain is not that they will continue to be a student athlete at the particular university, but we are pre-purchasing assets from them. Assets like social media posts, appearances, autographs. And so when a student athlete gets up and says, hey, I no longer want to be at this university for whatever reason, that's their decision. They're free to do it. But we have an expectation that they will see through the end of the contract. And if they don't, then there's two options. Option number one is that we don't have to pay them what their money is owed, right? Because they didn't finish their contract. Just like if you sign an agreement to work for a company and then you get up 6 months into it, they're not going to pay you the other 6 months. And if they say, well, we want our money, well, we're going to say, well, you have to follow through. And if you're transferring from Oklahoma to Texas, well, you're going to have to show up at an Oklahoma Sooners football event, even though you're a Texas football player. How many student athletes are going to want to do the latter? Pretty much nobody. So you can't have your cake and eat it too. That being said, my assumption is that the majority of athletes that are entering the portal, they may have an offer somewhere else already. But at the other end of it, last year, of all the student athletes that entered the portal, a good 1/3 of them didn't end up anywhere, meaning they thought they were going to get in the portal and make some money somewhere else, and they ended up without a scholarship at any program. So there are some student athletes that are going to have a very rude awakening, and perhaps that's just a good life lesson for them.
You mentioned the $400 million that's out there that you believe is going to be transacted this year. Matt Rule said last week between $1 million and $2 million for quarterback. Did he nail that, or did he undershoot it?
So there's about 10 to 15 schools maximum that are going to pay that type of money for a quarterback. I can tell you absolutely. Listen, we work with the University of Oklahoma. Dylan Gabriel went into the portal today. I've had conversations with Dylan in the past, and I've told him his market value is probably worth more than $1.5 million. But it doesn't mean that every quarterback is going to get paid that amount of money. Yesterday, I posted data that we have collected from our schools that gives a median look at how much student athletes are going to earn based on their rating. And the median quarterback on the FBS level, a top 25 quarterback, is going to make about $350,000. That being said, as of today, we're talking about the 23 season. There's maybe 20 to 30 football players that are actually making more than $1 million total in NIL. So there are not a lot of them. And most of those are quarterbacks.
You mentioned revenue sharing as well coming our way, and you said it as soon as 2025. What form does that take, and how does that get done? Where the universities who it's like taking their medicine on this and they really don't want to agree to this and make it work?
I think the universities are not going to have the choice to agree to it. Mm-hmm. It's going to be a forced decision, and it's either going to be forced upon them through legislation. As an example, Senator Cruz is trying to push through legislation that allows for revenue sharing and creates a safe harbor position so that student athletes don't have to be deemed employees. I am not confident that any legislation will get through. And so it's most likely that this will either be forced upon them through the courts, which will have a decision by the end of next year on these subjects, or there will be some sort of preemptive move, likely by the SEC conference. What I can tell you is that as an organization that works with several SEC schools, the schools have begun, and this is not anything that isn't out there. There's a reason why the biggest collectives in college sports are in the SEC. And it's not just because there's more money at a school like Alabama than there is at a school like Michigan. It is that the SEC is preparing themselves. They're weaning themselves off of that money that used to go to the athletics department and saying, hey, in a year or two, we're going to be at revenue share anyway. We're going to have to pay our football players at least $10 million. We might as well learn to do it today instead of being surprised next year or in 2 years when we have to do it formally. But for all the other schools, they're not prepared. There are many Power 5 institutions that are operating at $1-2 million in NIL for their football teams. They will not survive this transition into a revenue share environment, unfortunately.
Jason, how many of the players that are a part of the collectives that you run, the ones who do sign agreements with whatever school, SEC, Big Ten, ACC, Pac-12, Big 12, or Troy, for example, in the Sun Belt, or somebody else in the American, how many of them actually, in your opinion, understand it's not just they get money, but what they have to do in return?
The majority have an understanding that there is some sort of requirement. Most of them believe that they are signing this contract because they are getting paid to play at that particular university. But that's not the truth, right? The truth is that we have to be able to go out there and actually create value from this. It's not my decision as a business owner what happens, whether or not that kid plays a snap, whether or not he performs well. There is an expectation of return on value. And we have, again, I can only speak for us and our organization that runs these collectives, we have an expectation that that value will be returned to us. Some collectives may not, right? There may be a collective at a school that says we're simply a conduit to launder money to players. Mm-hmm. And we don't care whether or not they actually do anything for it. For us, it's a very different operation. And so it's, a unique position that we have to be able to balance. I mean, it's no secret. I'll give you an example again. I'll use Dylan Gabriel. I think very highly of him, but we're running a big campaign at Oklahoma right now, and Dylan is the star of that campaign. Well, today he's no longer an Oklahoma football player, and so I have to be able to deal with the repercussions, the business repercussions of having his image posted on advertisements that no longer validate what I'm trying to sell. And so that is a reality, right? If you're going to move and transfer and you did an endorsement deal with the local business, that business is not going to be interested in working with you anymore, and they're going to feel like your contract was breached.
Can you go back and go back to what you were saying about the SEC and sort of preparing behind the scenes? I'm sure, as you well know, Jason, there's been this long-standing fear, and it's really bubbled up here with all the realignment the last few years about the break-off, right? The Super 2, the Power 2, the break-off. Kind of playing into what you said, that certainly feels like that's one of those types of issues that could further enhance or completely separate the haves from the have-nots. Is that how you see it? And would you lump in the Big Ten because of all the money that they're getting? Or do you feel, or do you sense that they're preparing in much the same way? For example, those two kind of being on an island by themselves, doing things a different way, whereas the others don't or can't play that way necessarily.
Yeah, so clearly there's a larger delta in the SEC and the Big Ten as it relates to total athletic budget, total revenue via multimedia rights, and other initiatives, ticket revenue and other deals. Obviously, Michigan State generates a lot more money in ticket revenue than Rutgers. But it's not just the SEC. I can't sit here and say to you that Mississippi State and Vanderbilt and Rutgers and Northwestern are going to be part of this new whatever college football looks like in the next couple of years, because they don't bring the same type of value that a lot of these other larger institutions do. And so the short answer is that, yes, part of it is the money, and these leagues are quietly preparing themselves, but it doesn't mean that each of these institutions are going to be part of that transition. And if they want to be part of that transition, I'm a Rutgers alum, I played football there. If Rutgers wants to be part of that, Rutgers is going to have to make some very difficult decisions about the number of programs that it has. Maybe the most guaranteed implication of what will happen when we move to revenue share is that we will see women's sports, as an example, gutted, absolutely gutted across these institutions. Because if I have 100 football player and basketball players that I need to pay now, likely as employees, that's 100 women's scholarships I no longer need and no longer can afford to have. And that's just the reality.
So with Title IX, that means also that some men's sports are going to get it as well, because you got to make those things balance, right?
Not necessarily, because what Title IX says an equal balance, but if a student athlete is deemed an employee, they're no longer a student athlete, they're an employee. Oh. And so you no longer have to balance out 85 football scholarships with 85 women's scholarships in other sports.
Jason,
so there goes all your women's programs.
I'm sorry, but would that then also all of a sudden, for a group that has more important things to deal with than college athletics, would that then not get people in Congress' eyes a little more focused, because they'll get hammered if, in fact, women's sports just disappears?
It's too late by then. I mean, it'll be too late. If once it happens, how could any congressman or senator come in and say, well, you can't do this? What are they going to tell their state university? Come up with an extra $10 million? It's too late, right? What are they going to start appropriating state taxes to do it? Well, good luck, right? The point is, if they don't fix that solution now, they're going to have a problem, which is why Senator Cruz's legislation is really the only thing that likely can save women's sports, because what it does is it allows that safe harbor position that basically says that football and basketball players will not be considered employees. And so it allows some flexibility for the university from that perspective. But, you know, we all know what Congress is doing these days, and I'm not very optimistic that they're going to be able to find the solution to this when there's a lot of other bigger problems they have to worry about.
Yeah, like staying open.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. So we didn't do this at the beginning, but we probably should here at the end, just for people who maybe been joining us like in the middle. What does Athlete NIL as a group, what does your organization do that's maybe a little different than just being a solitary collective of ex schools fans that are sending money out to players?
Yeah, so I appreciate that. We are what we refer to as an agency of record. We are now the largest deal maker in NIL. We have more than 1,000 student athletes that are under retainer contract with us across more than 40 different institutions. So we are essentially going into institutions, starting collectives, and putting entire rosters on contracts where those student athletes are working off that money by doing activations for us, whether those are social media posts or other things. And so if you go to Oklahoma, as an example, where probably some of your listeners are from, every single football, men's basketball, and softball athlete at the university is under our payroll. No different than any of our other institutions. So we have a lens across multiple schools versus one independent collective that may be just hustling for their individual athletes. We are now distributing more money and doing more deals than any single entity out there, other than the NCAA, put it that way.
All right, Jason, good stuff. We appreciate it. Thank you for your time, and good luck with whatever moves forward in the business of NIL. And speaking of that, of course, we